The cardiovascular system is responsible for using blood to circulate and transfer nutrients to tissues and remove wastes from those tissues. It consists of blood, which travels inside a network of tubes called blood vessels, and is propelled by a pump we call the heart. At its most basic, that's all the cardiovascular system is: a pump, some tubes, and liquid being transported. The aim of the cardiovascular system is to send just the right amount of blood to wherever it is needed. Too little, and the target tissue does not have enough nutrients to do what is needed. Send too much, and you just waste energy. To hit that Goldilocks zone, we have a control system that tries to keep the cardiovascular system at the perfect amount of supply. The ability to maintain a default state of optimum efficiency is termed homeostasis. Maintaining homeostasis is incredibly important for the cardiovascular system. Let's look at the basics by assuming the cardiovascular system is a closed system. The definition of a closed system is where two or more processes have outputs determined by a common parameter and can operate at a stable equilibrium with each other. What this means is that what we've got is what we've got. We can't magically get more or less blood, but we can rearrange and redistribute what is already there. Mathematically, this could be expressed as something like A equals B times C equals D times E. If A remains unchanging, anything that happens to B, C, D, or E is going to have an effect on everything else in order to keep A constant. Let's look at an example. The amount of blood pumped out the heart to the body is called cardiac output, or CO. It is measured in liters per minute. We can adjust cardiac output by either changing the amount of blood ejected each time the heart pumps, what we term as stroke volume, or change the number of times the heart beats per minute, what we call the heart rate. Therefore, cardiac output is equal stroke volume times heart rate. This relationship is why really fit people have lower heart rates than the rest of us, but don't faint. They still have sufficient cardiac output, by using a higher stroke volume with that lower heart rate. However, in the real world there is another factor we need to consider. The heart can only pump if it is receiving fluid to pump. Anyone who's ever watched the oxygen pump in a fish tank run dry knows what it's like if the pump doesn't get enough fluid. The return of blood to the heart that allows it to pump is what we call venous return. Seeing as we only get what we put into the pump, our equation updates to read cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, which is equal to venous return. From this, it's clear that changes in venous return have an effect on everything else. In case you were wondering, this balance is referred to as Starling's law of the heart. Increased venous return triggers a number of mechanisms that can increase stroke volume, leading to an increased cardiac output. Understanding this relationship is super important, because things are about to get a little bit trickier. If we look at one side of the heart in isolation, it has two parts, the atrium and the ventricle. The ventricle is responsible for pumping out as much blood as it receives. We can use contraction of the atrium to fill up the ventricle a bit faster in between each beat, and doing so allow the ventricle to pump more blood. However, doing so increases pressure in the atrium. This sounds great, but there's one problem. The atrium still has to receive blood from the veins, which operate at really low pressures. So if we increase atrial pressure, that makes it harder for the veins to fill the atrium, because they're lower pressure. But increasing atrial pressure also allows us to fill the ventricles faster, and thus pump more blood out to the body. What do we do with this paradox? What we need to do is try and find a sweet spot in our closed system where we can use atrial pressure to fill the ventricles as quickly as possible, but do so without dropping venous return too low. Our mathematical relationship can be updated a bit to read as cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, which is equal to venous return, assuming that venous return is equal to the venous pressure minus the atrial pressure, but also knowing that an increased atrial pressure allows for an increase in heart rate and an increase in stroke volume. This all seems a little confusing, right? Let's try looking at it graphically. What this graph here shows is that an increase in right atrial pressure results in a decrease in venous return. It also shows that an increase in atrial pressure causes an increase in cardiac output. As we know, venous return has to be equal to cardiac output, so the point at which these two lines cross has to be the optimum point of maximum efficiency in our closed system. It turns out that this point is around 3 to 4 millimeters of mercury. This is our perfect compromise between venous return and cardiac output. Pretty cool, huh? So what happens from here if we want to go and do some exercise? We know that to move around we need more cardiac output than we do at rest. which means we need a higher atrial pressure to fill that ventricle. But we can't do this without increasing venous return. So what do? Turns out we've got a number of mechanisms to help with this. The first is that our cardiac control system is able to activate mechanisms to increase venous return. This includes activating smooth muscle in the venous system to constrict the vessels and increase pressure. It can also involve deep breathing and the usage of skeletal muscle, which can actually all squeeze on our veins, helping to push blood back to the heart, and by doing so, increasing venous return. And it just so happens we do a lot of deep breathing and skeletal muscle movement when we're doing exercise. The other thing that happens is the heart is able to increase its ability to relax between beats, making it easier to fill. Or to put it another way, you don't need as much atrial pressure to push the blood into the ventricles. If we look at our updated graph now, this shifts everything up a little bit, resulting us in having increased cardiac output. Hopefully, having walked through this process makes understanding the balance of factors within the cardiovascular system a little bit clearer. Everything that goes with cardiovascular physiology from here links back to the same simple equation. Cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, which is equal to venous return. The rest of the pathophysiology is simply about understanding what happens when problems occur with any of these factors. For example, how to send cardiac output where it needs to go when it leaves the heart, or what happens if something happens to our system to reduce our venous return, for example, losing lots of fluid, or what if something impairs our ability to even generate cardiac output. Understanding this allows us to understand everything that comes next. Hope this has been a help. See you on the next one.